Instead, we have the opportunity to make a habit of empathy, to recognize ourselves in each other.
Hi, it's Edwin Rutsch from the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy. I'm here today with Marco Iacoboni, who's from UCLA, and I'm very so pleased to have you here today, Marco, because in my studies of empathy, one of the first books I read was yours, Mirroring People. So to kind of have the chance to be here with you today is like a real treat.
Thank
Um,
you. Thank you for having me.
I have your web page up here, at least a web page. I'm going to throw it up on the screen, and it's from the Brain Research Institute at UCLA, and it
Yes.
says that you're a professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences and professor in residence at the Semel Institute. And it goes on to say how you've been studying mirror neurons, imitation, empathy, and social cognition. Would you like to say more, a little bit more about yourself, if anything you'd like to add to that?
Sure. Well, first of all, as you can gather from my accent, I'm Italian, and I've been trained as a neurologist back in Italy. Then I moved to UCLA, and I wanted to just stay here for a brief period of time to do a research project. But then here, the environment is so exceptional. It's incredible, especially for the kind of science I do, which is brain imaging. And so they offered me a professorship. I stayed here. That was almost 20 years ago. I never left. And I went back to Italy. I mean, I go back to Italy to see my family, but I'm pretty happy where I'm located. And I started studying mirror neurons mostly because when I started, my main research interest has always been perception and action. When putting together these two things. And if you think about it, we do it all the time. Even when we do things that are considered really intellectual things, like writing something, you still need to put together what you perceive and how you act, even for very simple things like writing. So it's really a fundamental thing in life. And I've always been interested in how does the brain do that? And then at some point, I ran into Rizzolatti, which is one of the original discoverers of these cells in the monkey brain, these mirror neurons. We were both in Prague for a meeting. And he told me about these cells, and I thought this stuff is really cool. And I started, a collaboration with them, and we started doing brain imaging here at UCLA while they were doing neurophysiology in the monkey brain back in Italy. And to me, the whole point of mirror neurons is really that it's about getting easily into the minds of other people. Because the whole story is that this is the surprising finding of this discovery is that some motor cells in our brain that we use to send commands to our muscles to, say, grasp a cup of coffee, they also activate when we are not moving at all. We're just watching somebody else making the same action. It's almost as if by watching you making an action, my mirror neurons become activated as if I'm watching myself reflected by a mirror.
So as I'm watching you right now, I noticed your hand was kind of out here, and I could feel what it was like to have that. And I'm seeing you smile now and shake your head.
Exactly.
Kind of, there's this mirroring that kind of takes place. And this is like the foundation of empathy, as I
Correct.
understand it.
Correct. And in fact, it really maps, this is a neuroscience discovery, but it really maps well onto the phenomenology because a lot of people realize that in social interactions, that's what we do. We kind of synchronize our bodies. We make the same actions, the same postures with the body. And those things actually help us getting connected. Our minds get together by using these very simple bodily tricks. So it's really a fundamental phenomenon for empathy. And that's the way I started.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you're really interested in kind of the nuts and bolts of how things work. Is that right? I mean, this is like
Yeah,
mirror neurons. We're talking about, the individual cells and how
right.
things work. I don't know. Maybe you were, as a kid, putting together, parts or something. Is it something that you've had
Well,
an interest in, kind of the nuts and bolts of things?
yeah, well, that's what scientists tend to do. We try to understand how things work. And to try to understand that, you really kind of have to dissect the phenomenon, these components. And then you kind of have to put them both, again, back together and to come up with a model on how things really work. So yeah, we're interested in those nuts and bolts. But it seems to me that this is a relatively simple phenomenon. Of course, the devil is always in the details. Then how you implement or you actually use this system in everyday situations that are always complex. We haven't figured that out. There are still plenty of things we have to understand and discover. But the whole phenomenon of mapping your own actions and the actions of other people onto your own motor system is really a basic fundamental phenomenon that happens in our brain and make us connect. Our minds get connected in this simple way.
So it's really about how we can get connected and get more connected with other people and with groups and within society, which kind of leads to kind of how I kind of wanted to frame the discussion, because I'm really interested in how do we go about building a culture of empathy. Mm-hmm. It's like, how do we deepen that connection that you're talking about? And there's so many things that maybe block that connection with people. And so I'm kind of wondering, how does your work kind of inform the notion of creating a culture of empathy, which is basically raising the empathy level within society, raising the level of connection between people?
That's a beautiful question. It actually happens, I think, at many different levels. Let me talk about, for instance, just the kind of level that we're actually doing right now, just talking about it. So this phenomenon is a phenomenon. I mean, first of all, it tells us that evolution has devised in our brains a system that is a relatively simple system that as I say in the book, make us wired for empathy. So that's great news. We've been taught for centuries that we are selfish beings, always, preoccupied with self-maximizing profits for ourselves, and that's it. And it's all about the struggle for survival, and that's the traditional teaching of human nature. I think it's all wrong. I think that we have a natural predisposition to be empathic. Of course, things are much more complex than that, but let's just stay here for a moment. The fact that now we have made this discovery, that we found a system in the brain that really makes us empathic, and tell us that evolution has selected the system, a mechanism in the brain that makes us so empathic, it's already great news. It's something that's worth telling people. That's the reason why I basically wrote the book. It's, I'm a scientist. I tend to write, scientific papers for my colleagues, grant applications for NIH. But I wanted to write a book for general readers because I wanted to tell this beautiful story that comes out of the lab. We are really wired for empathy. Now, we realize that, and that already changes us. The realization that we have this system in our brain, it's already we are thinking about ourselves and the fact that we have this thing. And I think it's already giving us more capacity for empathy, just the fact that we reflect about it. So that's one level.
So it's for generations, scientists and philosophers have been telling us, hey, it's a struggle for survival. Everybody's in it for themselves. And so people start adapting to that message that they've been hearing. And now Correct. You're saying, hey, that message has been wrong, that we're actually wired, we're physiologically wired for empathy and for connection. And just having that sense, that realization kind of changes the whole dynamics of how we think about other human beings and about ourselves.
Absolutely. That's correct. And that's one of the motivations why I wanted to write the book. Now, consider this. This is really something that happens in our Western world. If you look at Eastern cultures or some other kinds of cultures, they're much more collectivistic than our own culture. The Western culture is really individualistic. There are all these dogmas about the self and the individual being successful, getting the best grades, getting the best jobs, getting the highest incomes, and so on. But traditional cultures, for instance, in Asia, they're much more collectivistic. So it's not that it's something that all the cultures embrace this individualism. It's mostly a Western kind of thing. And in fact, I mean, a lot of the neuroscience that we do, in a way, the take-home message of the research we do maps well onto, for instance, Eastern philosophy. I was talking to the Dalai Lama a few months ago in Brisbane, and I was telling him the whole story about mirror neurons, and I was telling that, indeed, Eastern philosophies have realized much better than Western ones about self and other, about the connection between self and other. And so that's something to keep in mind. But yeah, I mean, the realization of it, the message that we send out from the lab, that we have this system in the brain, it's already a powerful message. People get this, they map it well on their own experience, because they realize that when they go around and they meet people, there is all this kind of synchrony of bodies and so on. And because they connect, they are also aware, I think they already increase their tendency to empathize. And then they start reflecting on it. And I think that's an important step, and could be just a virtuous circle, because people realize that they are empathic individuals, but just by doing that become a little bit more empathic. And the good news about mirror neurons is that emotions and predispositions are also contagious because of this mirroring. So if I'm a very empathic individual, I tend to transmit this empathy. And I generally I'm able also to transmit it to you. And then you become more empathic. And so it gets into some sort of a virtuous circle, which is great.
So it sounds like what you're saying is there's kind of like a modeling of empathy. So if we want to build a culture of empathy, we're going to have to model empathy. I mean, we're going to have to manifest empathy. It's like we can't be maybe judging people and say, you better be empathic, because
Correct.
People are going to be mirroring our judgment and our finger pointing. So
That's right. In fact, I mean, that's one of the coolest thing about this. So when you think, how can you do some sort of intervention about empathy? How can you make people more empathic? You can't have an explicit teaching, do this or do that. The first thing you need to do is to really get yourself into the mind or the shoes of the other person. That's the first step to create an empathic connection. And when you do that, then you're able to have this really meaningful interaction with the other individual. And you can start thinking of how can we actually increase empathy in others. And it's all about, again, this idea that being attuned to other people. Try to see the point of view of the other individual. Use the imagination to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. And all these things all together, I don't have a recipe. I don't have a very specific way of doing intervention. I'm a neuroscientist. But it seems to me that if we understand the mechanism in the brain that make us empathic, then those mechanisms and those principles in the brain can inspire us on how to make ourselves even more empathic.
So it seemed to be you're talking about modeling. So one was modeling empathy, and it kind of brings me to the question of kind of defining empathy, because I'm finding that people are kind of defining it like all over the place, and they've even talked with people like Paul Ekman. He says, I'm interested in compassion, but I had to look at empathy, and it's a mess, And, I've seen, talks by, I think it was Daniel Bateson, and he's kind of tried to create, some definitions, or at least show how the word is kind of defined. Do you have kind of like a working definition that you're operating from?
Well, my take on this is a very empathic one. There are many different definitions of empathy, and that's not surprising because empathy is a complex thing. My view is that there are many different forms of empathy. The empathy that, say, a guard in a prison may have for the prisoners is very different from the kind of empathy that, say, a surgeon may have for the patient, or that a mother may have for a child. So these are different forms of empathy. I think the real problem that we have is that we don't have a good taxonomy of all these different kinds of empathies. So my position is that if you look at all the definitions that are in the literature about empathy, they're all good. They all capture some aspects of empathy. What we need is some scholar that makes really a systematic taxonomy and categorize all these different forms in all these different kinds of interaction. And if we had that tool, that would be a really valuable tool for research on empathy and for understanding empathy. But my message is that it's a complex thing. Most of the definitions are correct, but there's no definition that captures empathy in its entirety because it's a complex thing. And there are very different forms of empathy. And so we really have to kind of understand all of them.
Well, I've been looking at a lot of the definitions. I'm very eclectic in my view and exploration of empathy. So I kind of pull in a little bit from everybody, the scientists, the artists, the academics, the mediation community. So I've kind of come up with kind of like a simple 4 parts of empathy of what I call self-empathy, which is basically kind of self-awareness, mindfulness, sort of a self-knowledge, and kind of being able to feel what's going on in ourselves. Mm-hmm. And then it's sort of like the deeper we can go for doing that self-empathy, it allows for the mirrored empathy, or sometimes it's called the emotional or affective empathy. So we're able to feel the mirror, that if we're going to mirror someone, we need a clean mirror. If we're all stressed and not aware of ourselves, we're kind of blocking that mirroring process. Yes. And then there seems to be another component, which I hear, it's often called perspective taking or cognitive empathy, but it seems to be more around imagination, that you kind of, just like an actor imagines themselves from the point of view of someone else, and they kind of take on that position, and they can kind of, take on that role. And mm-hmm. then there seems to be, I've kind of seen within the mediation community, is that when people are in conflict, they don't have empathy. I mean, the empathy is really low. And there's kind of this process where you get them to empathize with each other. And then towards the end, they actually do something together. And it's like this empathic action. And I've heard it kind of defined as, someone defined it as empathy is when the blocks to action are removed that don't exclude. So it's that people are working together in sort of a sense of harmony because they've really connected with the feelings and the needs and the values and the desires of others. So I'm just wondering how that is a sort of it's one more model out there.
Right. I like it. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. It maps well onto many phenomena and also many studies. Mirror neurons, I believe, work really well at the level of the emotional empathy, but they also work. I mean, it seems to me that you have to think about this thing almost as a building, in which there are different floors. The first floor could be your self-empathy, and then on top of that you have the emotional empathy, and on top of that you have the perspective-taking cognitive empathy, and then in the last floor, the 4th story of the building, you have the action empathy. Each one built onto the other, it seems to me. I'm not so sure that we need to start from the self. Again, it's one of the classical Western obsessions, always starting from ourselves. I have this idea that, in fact, when we are born and thrown into the world, it's all about us. It's not about, we don't have a sense of self. We actually carve out a sense of self after having many interactions with other people, with our caregivers, because when we are really, really young, we live through our caregivers. But certainly, I believe that there is this emotional basis for empathy, and then it gets more cognitive, and then it becomes even more, the action component of empathy is a very deliberate form, especially when you talk about mediation and that kind of settings. They're really deliberate behaviors.
So we're really kind of waiting for some real good scholar to come out there and really kind of help us, create some real clarity around this. And I've heard a lot of attacks on empathy, and the attacks and the criticism. A lot of them are very confused in the sense they'll confuse empathy with sympathy, and other feelings. So
Right.
there's this desperate need for a clear definition. So
That is true. I think that the attacks are also motivated by the fact that there is now this really big wave of research on empathy and awareness and interest on empathy, and these new, scholarly activities are in a way challenging the traditional framework of a human being as the selfish being that really is just a self-maximizer that comes from really traditional thinking. And that thing hasn't disappeared. It's still there. There's still plenty of people that support that view. And I think they feel threatened by this raising interest in empathy and the kind of studies that we are doing. And so those are the kind of attacks that people that study empathy tend to get. But it's true that it would be nice to have this framework because it would clarify a lot of the confusion. And in fact, most of the attacks on the research on empathy are really misdirect attacks because they confuse one thing for another.
yeah, so having a clear definition about empathy would be one step towards building a culture of empathy. Did you have other ideas for steps for building a culture of empathy?
Yeah, I mean, I would start again from simple things. I mean, the whole point of mirroring is that you basically model the behavior of other people. So it seems to me that imitation is a great way of becoming empathic. I believe I never done brain imaging studies on actors or performers, but I believe that those kind of people tend to be extremely empathic because they use their body to model the movements and the actions of other people. And so that would be a good way of improving empathy between individuals. Another one, which is really radical, is that let's throw away our beliefs. If there is something that really divides humans, are our beliefs. We all eat, we all sleep, we all walk around, but then we start labeling each other. I'm a progressive, you're a conservative, or whatever. We can, if unfortunately the beliefs divide us more than they don't help much. So my invitation is to really look at other people, even people that you disagree with, in terms of that's a fellow human being. Let's try to understand each other. Let's try to do things together. That seems to me a fundamental step toward a culture of empathy.
To see the humanity of others and kind of maybe the beliefs become those blocks to empathy in some
Correct.
way, the judgments and
They become blinders. I mean, my idea is that let's throw away, especially these massive belief systems that people follow. They're really not. I mean, I can see why they're still so powerful in our society because they become a way of creating social groups, and people have this tendency, and that's one form of empathy. For instance, the idea is that you have to belong to a group. So you belong to the group of conservatives or liberals. And that's a way for you to identify with a group and to become very empathic with the members of your own group. But then you become completely unempathic for the members of the other group. So let's just get rid of all this. Let's just remember that we are fundamentally humans, that we are all the same, that we all need the same things. And let's start from that.
well, I can mention my own stories. I came to this initially kind of from the progressive point of view. I actually came from a conservative family, so my family are conservative. Kind of got more into the progressives. There was a lot of arguments, in the family, and I was always interested in values, and that quest kind of led me to the importance of empathy. And as I've gotten more into empathy, it's like I've just kind of saying, well, this is, I don't really identify less and less as progressive, as more as kind of an empath or empathic person.
That's
And
right.
so I've actually been to the conservative, at the Republican state convention, and talked to them about empathy, talked to the Tea Party, talked to Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of reminds me of something I saw you, I think in a post you did somewhere. Did you say something about the government needs to model empathy? I don't know if that was something, but it would seem that if we have this fight in Congress and all that, it's really not modeling empathy.
Correct. Oh, yeah. That's right. I mean, Yeah, that's the recent post in which I was talking about leaders. I mean, because, so let's go back to the idea of imitation. We have this tendency to imitate. And that's a fundamental way in which, first of all, we learn how to do things. So it's really important for social learning because we look at other people that are skilled at doing things, and we learn just by watching. And the other thing that is imitation is important about is important because it's a fundamental way of doing transmission of culture. So we have that. But even if we have this kind of tendency to imitate, we don't imitate everybody. We call it imitation bias. And there are two well-established imitation biases. One is that we tend to imitate people like us. So people that are more similar to us, we imitate them more. And by doing that, we empathize more with them because there is a strong link between imitation and empathy. The more I tend to, if you don't know me and we go out and I start imitating you, not in an overt way, in a kind of a covert but nice way in which I tend to, and empathic people tend to do it automatically. Then eventually, when we kind of go each one for our own way, and you think about me, you think that I'm a nice guy. So when people imitate you, you like them more. Imitation is some sort of a social glue, and it increases empathy. So, but we don't imitate everybody equally. We tend to imitate more people like us, and we tend to imitate more people that have power, social status. So leaders have a strong moral responsibility because they have to model an empathic behavior. Because if they don't do that, people that, the other people look at them and they automatically tend to imitate that unempathic behavior, which is really bad. I mean, society really needs empathy. So I agree. I mean, certainly what we see from our politicians doesn't help much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we need those politicians to model it. And that would be kind of one way of building the culture of empathy is to see it modeled more out
Correct.
in society. And there's so many things. When I look at the debates, for example, they're set up in a confrontational fight mode.
Yeah.
Versus in an empathy mode where people really get to know each other and kind of create a kind of a deeper connection.
Yes, I mean, there is on the web. There is my meeting with the Dalai Lama. There is a link. Maybe you have it in your.
I do on the page.
If you see how the Dalai Lama and myself we interact, it's really about a conversation. Whereas all these debates are all about, you're right, confrontations. I think that's also a culture of the media. The media, they kind of tend to set it up in that way because they think that a confrontation, a fight, in a way, sort of increases the interest in the audience. But I think that's really not a good thing to do. I mean, ideally, we should do exactly what you're suggesting, to have these debates, especially these high-profile debates that are not about confrontation, but about similarities, about trying to understand what are the common platform of all these politicians. But that doesn't really happen, and the system doesn't seem to be framed that way.
So another kind of aspect of creating a culture of empathy for me is kind of having the intention to do it. It's like saying, this is something that I want to do, and let's do it. And so that's kind of what I'm taking a strong stand in, is let's just do it. We got to create this culture of empathy. And what I'm kind of wondering is about how do we kind of build that intention? And it's going to be people probably, thinking, hey, this is something that's really good and valuable for me. They're going to need, something there to kind of drive them forward, to take the effort and the energy to build a culture of empathy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I agree with you. I think that, first of all, we have this idea that when it comes to human behavior, I like to go back to simple things, because those are the things they study in the lab, that we kind of react to external stimuli. But in fact, it's almost the opposite. It's always about our actions are always, the origin of our actions is always an intention. So having, as you say, I want to build this thing, I want to have the intention is already the first step. It's very important. Just to even say that's what I want to do. It's so important. Then the question is, how do you go about and do it? And I think there are many different ways, but the fact that you have that intention is already in itself the first action that you can make to build the type of empathic society. Again, it seems to me that, for example, the kind of stuff you're doing is incredibly useful because, you have a repository of all these different forms of research on empathy, of empathic behavior, of text and narratives about empathy. And the beauty of it is that it's so interdisciplinary. I mean, if you talk of almost anything else in the brain, I wouldn't be talking to, say, a dancer or an artist or a writer. But with empathy, because it's something that really goes into all sorts of aspects of our society, that's exactly what we have to do. I mean, it's not just about the brain mechanism, it's about how, a performer perceives and experiences empathy, and how regular people do that. And so it's important to have these interdisciplinary collaborations and debates about and discussions about empathy. So that seems to me a fundamental way of actually building a culture of empathy.
Yeah, so have a very interdisciplinary, bring all the different disciplines together, and is that, so understanding that correctly, is that empathy is kind of overlaps with almost every discipline in some way.
Right.
And so we're bringing them all together to have that dialogue, which we're going to be doing in our next talk, which will be a panel discussion. And and you've mentioned several times about dance and the arts and acting. And I guess, is that something that resonates with you? Or are you somehow
Oh, yeah, it does. I mean, it seems to me also that recently there's been a lot of interest in the performing arts about mirror neurons. So and in a way, that's kind of, it's an interesting trajectory, because we started with studying these cells in the lab, in the neuroscience lab. The first group of people, of scholars that were outside neuroscience, that were interested in empathy, were philosophers, because philosophers of mind were really interested in mirror neurons and empathy. And then, other kinds of scientists or scholars, like political scientists. And now we're really getting into the performing arts, into the creative world. And it seems to me that that's the kind of people that can give us incredible insights about empathy, because they tend to be very empathic individuals. And after all, it's all about this. It's about encounters. It's about, because we have this predisposition in our brains, it's a system you can't override it. If you have with the current control, you can override pretty much everything. But because it's there, it seems to me that when you create the situation that allows an encounter between people, that's already a way of increasing empathy, because these people that encounter each other, they will look at each other, they will realize that they have similar interests, and that connection starts right away.
Yeah, that's something I'm looking at, as the social structures, because it seems like there's different social structures that actually can foster or inhibit empathy. For example, in a classroom, if you have a classroom and it's just a teacher teaching to the students, and if you measured maybe the oxytocin and the level of empathy, it would be at a certain level. But if you change the structure so it was small group discussions kind of going on, it might raise the bar. And so it's really looking at, how is our social structures designed, and how can we redesign them so that they, just by the structure itself, it promotes empathy.
Absolutely. And I mean, there are even architects that are interested in mirror neurons and empathy, because even the environments that we build can increase or decrease empathy. The setting in the classroom, it's a big, you're totally right. It's a big, it can make a big difference. The classical setup in a classroom is really not good for increasing empathy. You're right. And there are few things that can be done to improve it. Even when I go around and I give a lecture, the whole setting of a lecture is all wrong, because I'm standing up on a podium and talking about this stuff, and everybody else is listening. Our brain is built more for conversations like the one we are having now, rather than having somebody up there and everybody else listening for half an hour or an hour. So there are many things that we actually can do, very simple things, that if we think about it, they can really improve our capacity to empathize and our empathy in our society.
Well, another thing I want to go back to, since you've mentioned the arts, I think the arts is really a great form for deepening empathy, and it's even, you see in the schools, the arts are one of the things that are cut, right? So
yeah.
I do a weekly kind of a freestyle dance. So I was just dancing last night, and it's just total freestyle, total, moving any way that you want, and people dance alone, dance with other people. And once I did a workshop, which was like a conflict resolution workshop, which is really all about empathy. And I was like bathed in, this empathy. And I felt there was like this quality that I felt more grounded in the empathy, like less fear, less stress, more openness to kind of be present. And then when the next day I went to this dance, and I said, just emotionally, I said to the people I was dancing with, I want to get who you are. I want to mirror who you are. I want to reflect and really understand who you are. But I was going to do it at a felt level. So I didn't say this, verbally.
Right.
And so I would mirror people,
Right.
and it was like we would, and sometimes they're moving really fast, and I wouldn't kind of get where they were. You could feel there was a break in the mirror, and then in the reflection, and sometimes they would really see that I was trying to reflect them, and they would slow down so that I could catch up with their mirroring. And
Nice.
then at some point it felt like we kind of clicked together, and it's like there's this real beauty. It's like I already know where they're going to go, and,
Right.
and then I offer a new movement, a creative, energetic movement, and they'll copy it or play with it, and there's this just beautiful synchronicity and creativity that kind of comes out of it. So I think the arts is really, is just, and all the processes in the arts, they've developed processes for learning how to do this. How do you
Yes.
mirror? How do you not, how do you say yes to an energy instead of trying to crush it? You embrace that energy and kind of go with the flow.
Absolutely. I think that's the motor system in our brain is really, and the body itself is really built for these kinds of things, for these coordinated actions. We're really skilled at using our body, and the body is really the first step to empathize and then to feel the emotions and to connect. And when you do, you describe very well the phenomenology of what happens is that you may have a deliberate kind of initial plan to kind of synchronize your body with somebody else, and then when there is that recognition from the other person, you guys start getting close to each other. Then at some point you know that it's your body doing it. You're not even doing it anymore. In fact, if you're too deliberate, that's going to hurt. You have to let go in a way. And that creates that magic connection, which is really based on really simple mechanism in the body and in the nervous system to predict what's going to happen next. Because that's, our nervous system is really important for this kind of things. We need to have, because we make a lot of actions very quickly, we have to have a system that is able to, we can't wait for our sensory feedback for our own actions. It'd be too late. So we have to make a simulation of what's going to happen. If I go for, say, if I'm trying to catch a ball, I have to almost simulate what my whole experience before I actually start the motor plan. And that happens also in interactions. And that's what creates the connection. And it creates this really basic form of empathy. You can build on that. And it's exhilarating. It gives you happiness. It's probably, you have a dopamine rush in the brain.
Yeah, that's exactly it. When I talk about intentions, like, what's our intentions? People, why are we going to create a culture of empathy? Because it feels so good when it really works. So if people maybe feel that, that might be an incentive. At least it's an incentive for me. And I think there's the other quality that you're talking about is that intention or anticipation, that when I'm doing this dance, it's going so fast. I mean,
Right.
we're talking minutes. I mean, it's like, you've seen people just dance and they're just like all over the place. But I already know where they're going at this super high speed, because I kind of know energetically, I don't know what it is. It's like energetically, I know what the options already are or something. There's something about it that for me, that's a real, that being able to know already where they're going at that high of speed is really quite an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, I think that what happens is that your brain picks up really subtle cues from the body language of the other individual, and it can predict and it can synchronize. The other guy or does the same, and so it's relatively simple. Especially again, if you don't stop thinking about it, if you don't become too reflective, just let the body go, and you have this incredible synchrony between people.
Yeah, it's like somehow there's a quality of trust that has to be there for that to happen.
In fact, I mean, all the defenses go down because you are again. It's almost like, and if now go back to that moment in which you have this thing. Are you preoccupied about yourself? No, I don't think so. I don't think there is even a sense of self. There is a sense of us, maybe,
Yeah, exactly.
but not a sense of self. And that's really the nature of empathy. It's about us. It's no, as I said to the Dalai Lama, it's no longer Marco, it's no longer you, it's us.
Yeah, there's like this quality of it's like a shared awareness of two presences and kind of their interaction that kind of
Which is,
happens.
I mean, it's not even two presences anymore. It's
Yeah, it
just,
is. You're true. It is. Yeah. Uh-huh.
at least for a few magic
Hmm.
moments, just one thing.
Well, what is it then about the perspective taking in is that quality of us? Is that what the newborn baby is feeling? Is as I understand it, at about 18 months, they start having perspective taking and kind of can take another person's perspective and see where they're coming from. And what I was wondering
Yeah,
is that experience of us kind of what the newborn baby is experiencing? That's
that's
their
my that's my intuition that when we are born, we don't even have a sense of self. We start getting a sense of self when we are able to have these more sophisticated forms of imagination and perspective taking and more cognitive aspects of empathy. But the initial form of what we are for the first almost 2 years of our life, it's this sense of us, of belonging to a bigger unity than ourselves. In fact, there is no sense of self. So for the young baby, for the young brain, it's really there is no such a thing. We start thinking about the self only when again we are able to create these forms of perspective taking and become more cognitively sophisticated. But really, it's built on the basis of these interactions that the babies have with the caregivers. And at that level, there's no sense of self whatsoever.
Yeah, so it's that transition from sense of self to kind of perspective taking that I'm still trying to kind of get a real grasp on. I've seen those studies about, if a child, you have a box of crayons or something and you show them to a child and you say, "What's in here?" They say, "Oh, those are crayons." And then you open it and show that there's maybe candles and they say, "Oh, there's candles in there." Then they say, "Oh, what does this person who didn't see what was in there think is in there?" And they'll say, "Oh, they'll think there's candles." So they're
Mm-hmm.
not able to kind of switch to that
Right, exactly.
perspective of where that person is. That seems to be that kind of that imaginative, cognitive level of empathy.
Correct. And the way I think about it is that in my simplest model of empathy, there are two levels. A core level, which is this very basic form of mirroring and emotional empathy, and a higher level, which is more cognitive, which is kind of the control level for the lower level. So the idea is that the higher level, it kind of controls the lower level. And so when it comes, for instance, to this perspective taking or it's an initial form of saying, okay, yeah, that person is looking at things differently from me, and I have to imagine myself in his shoes in order to figure out what he's seeing, what he's perceiving. That's really a more sophisticated form of cognition. It requires some level of brain maturity.
Yeah, so that's that level that you were talking about. I think Franz de Waal talks about it. It sees that it has the model of a Russian doll, so these different layers
Right.
that kind of fit kind
Yeah.
of within each other. So a house foundation is also a nice metaphor. Wait, oh, metaphors. Talking about metaphors, empathy is often defined as the metaphor of standing in someone else's shoes and looking through someone else's eyes. And I've asked people, "What's your metaphor for empathy?" And don't use those, right? And it's amazing to me that almost everybody brings up a different metaphor for empathy. I mean, the imagination is amazing. So I'm wondering if, I don't know if you've done this before, but if you came up with your own metaphor of how empathy, works or is.
The thing is, I talk about empathy so much that I always come up with these much simpler and more often used forms. And it seems to me that because of the kind of mechanisms I study in the brain, those are really the ones in which mirror neurons that we know for sure are really powerful. This face-to-face interaction, watching into each other's eyes, or putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, which is some form of motor simulation. To put myself into your shoes at this point, what I have to do is almost imagine that my body is sitting in your studio. So all these things are really, the kind of things I think about, the most, the most common ones, because actually those are the ones that we have studied very well in the lab.
Well, in terms of a metaphor, I can share mine, which is, to me, empathy is like a cornucopia. So, and it's a sharing of cornucopias. The cornucopia is this horn of plenty that, all these wonderful fruits and vegetables just kind of come out. And I see each of us as kind of like a cornucopia. I'm a cornucopia of feelings, emotions, and you, and values in you as well. And we're kind of like, empathy allows us to share those cornucopias.
That's a very nice one, actually. It's great.
Yeah, I love those artistic. I mean, the metaphors. I did a workshop at the UC Berkeley here for the Peace and Conflict Studies, and I had all the students come up with their own metaphors, and it was amazing all the things they came up for empathy.
Nice.
So, well, okay, we've been at it for about 48 minutes. We can kind of officially maybe close this discussion, unless there's something you kind of have burning topic aspect. I can keep going for hours. But
oh yeah, I can see that.
You're looking a little tired of it.
No, it seems to me that it's we kind of covered the main aspects, and again, it seems to me that the interactions we had together almost kind of embodies the whole concept of empathy, which is really about trying to build something together to feel what the other person is feeling and to connect. So those are the main things, and it's been nice to do it.
Oh, great. Thank you.
See the world through other people's eyes. Empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.